Today we'll start our first class on the Analects. Why do I choose this subject to teach? In fact, I initiated this class because I wanted to study this text. And it is not because I am very eager in teaching this text, because I don't have a lineage or a transmission from the lineage masters or had any teachers give me teachings on this. And from this aspect, then it is not strictly speaking like the ones who are professionals and scholars who've studied and taught this and research quite a bit in terms of this text. I personally do not have such profound knowledge in this text particularly. I am not a Chinese scholar. I am not a historian. Some of the teachings, though, I think are quite... It could blend quite nicely with the religious teachings. So I'm just going to give the teaching based on my understanding. I'm not sure if lots of the scholars would be able to then accept my way of teaching it. It's okay if you can accept it. It's okay if you don't accept it. If you feel it's wrong, that's okay. If you feel that's right, that's okay too. In terms of studying as well as practice of Buddhism, I think lots of things when it comes to how to deal with people, how to how to live your life and so on. I think lots of the teaching within this is quite similar. According to Buddhism teaching, it says that if some theory that is very much connected or relevant to the liberation path, the teaching of liberation path, then we can still accept it and study it just as a Buddha Dharma, just as the Dharma that we study. So from the aspect of Buddhism text also give lots of teachings about how to then work around within the society, or how to then create harmonious interrelationships and so on. Therefore, I really want to initiate this study so that we can study together. So that was why I want to teach this. And now I'm going to talk about the history of the Analect. We know that the history of the Analects is in fact quite long time ago. And in Chinese history, there are the dynasties such as Yao, Shun, Yu, the three dynasties, the Xia dynasty, Shang dynasty, Zhou dynasty. That's included in the three dynasties. The Xia dynasty was 400 years, and the Shang dynasty was about 500 years, and the Zhou dynasty was about 800 years, or lasted about 800 years. And inside the Zhou dynasty, it has then Western Zhou dynasty as well as Eastern Zhou dynasty. Around the time of the Eastern Zhou dynasty, there's then the spring and autumn period, which lasted for about 400 years. And Confucius was born at that time. He was born 551 BCE, and he died around 479 BCE, and he lived for 72 years. And he was a great philosopher and is the one who started the philosophy of Confucianism. During my teaching of Dizigui, which is the rule for students, where I then talked about quite a bit of I Ching and some other teachings from the historical teachings, where within it then talks about some of the rituals of offering to the earth lords or offering to some of the local deities so that they'll bring wealth. In Tibetan, we say that Gongse Chikigyatso, which is a manifestation. Some would say that he is a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara or some other deities. Some ancient masters had such take on the role of him. So Confucius was born in the spring and autumn period. And during his time, it was rather quite a difficult period of time for him to live. It was filled with lots of war and lots of chaos and disharmony. It wasn't really the ideal period of time for people to live. But in terms of the world history, it was rather the period of time where the wisdom and lots of the philosophers all prosperous at that time. Philosophies all prosper at that time. It was during the time of Exile age. Around the age of 8 of Confucius, according to the UN as well as the Theravada calendar, that was then the day, that was the year that Buddha was born. I think a few days ago during the classes I said that according to the Buddhist calendar, this year is 2561 year of the Buddhist calendar, or the Buddhist year, from counting from the day the Buddha was born. And in such a way, then Buddha was born back in 543 BCE. And before that, Lao Tzu, the one who started Taoism, he was born back in 571 BCE. So he is 20 years senior than Confucius. And Confucius passed away back in 429 BCE. And after his death, around 10 years after his death, and Socrates was born in Greece, ancient Greece, in Athens. Then Socrates was born back in 469 BCE, and after 50 years of his passing, Plato was then born back in 427 BCE. And all of these philosophies still are studied and read by the modern people and passed down from over 2,000 years ago. And around 5th century BCE, that was the time during the human history a great number of philosophers who made great contributions to humanity. They were born around that time, most of them, in fact, and their philosophies are still prosperous in our modern world. That's something that we should contemplate upon. So Confucius taught the Analects, or Confucius rather gave teaching at that time and then later compiled into the Analects. During the Qing dynasty, that's after the Eastern Zhou dynasty, between Qing dynasty and Eastern Zhou dynasty, there were about 189 philosophers that was included in the historical text, including Mencius and Lao Tzu and many people from different countries at that time. Of course, at that time, the mainland was still separated into different regions and different countries, such as Qi, as Lu, as many different countries over there, divided into small countries. Due to political influence at that time, Qing dynasty killed lots of scholars and burned many books in order to fulfill his political ambition. So lots of the knowledge were then destroyed. The books and the wisdoms did not really pass down from that period of time. We probably studied it from our history textbooks. I wouldn't say that all the books were destroyed. Otherwise, the famous historian Sima Qian wouldn't be able to have the records or keep the records in later time. It is said that lots of books which were valuable, many people used to then hid those books in caves and in holes everywhere. In fact, during Cultural Revolution, I was the one who also hid many books, just as how I believe at that time in the history those people would do as well. During the Han Dynasty, the Emperor Han Wu, he had a rather very different idea than the previous Qin Shi Huang, who was the only emperor during the Qing dynasty. Therefore, during Han Dynasty, Han Emperor in fact tried to rediscover as well as preserve all the texts that were still left from the past. Many other things happen throughout the river of history. In fact, despite all the turbulence of historical changes and social changes, Confucius still continued till the modern day, despite the destruction during the Cultural Revolution or the movement of new culture, as well as a new revolution movement. the philosophy of Confucius and Mencius still were kept, although it did encounter lots of destruction during a cultural revolution, but it survived until now. The philosophy of Confucius lasted for a long period of time. As we can tell, it lasted for over 2,000 years. And let's look at how this teaching is propagated now. In some other countries, I think there are the teachings that's propagated more successfully, such as in Korea and in Japan. Around 400 to 500 CE, in their history, it was already recorded. The teachings of Confucius is already propagated, and people around that time adopted Confucius philosophy as a part of their culture, as their social regulations as well, and as a way of conducting themselves. But nowadays, with the GDP's rising and with the economic, with the focus on economic development, in fact, I think people are searching for the wealth or materialistic fulfillment, but so the countries such as Japan and Korea, their GDP as well as their technological development and their social advancements are still at the front row of all the countries in the world. At first, I thought not too many people would listen to my teachings on the Analects, but I think there are quite a number of people who are still listening. In fact, I think studying the Analects is still quite necessary, and it's going to be quite interesting because it may then help you to progress on the way of being a good human being. So we need to rely upon the study to elevate our devotion, our faith, and our compassion towards all sentient beings. So this is quite crucial. So we've already talked about the history. And now, let's talk about how the Analects are then discussed and taught from different aspects and different perspectives from many great masters from the history. In fact, I don't think it is necessary to distinguish a very certain wrong or certain right, a very solid right or wrong, because from such ancient text, we probably have different ways to then explain it and have different perspectives on it. This philosophy has passed on from 2,000 years ago, and our wisdom When we use our wisdom from our modern days, we should also still be able to receive great benefit from such an ancient text full of wisdom. Let's just simply think about how this language is so ancient. The language that is composed 2,000 years ago, we can still understand what it means. This is quite rare. After 2,000 years, we can still understand it. Tibetan language has the history of 1,300 years, and before the creation of Tibetan language, we don't really have any texts or any history recorded in language, because mostly we rely upon Sanskrit that came from India. Let's look at English. Not many people could understand the texts that were composed 600 or 700 years ago. Not many people could understand the content now. So it's quite extraordinary to still be able to understand the language that's passed down from 2,000 years ago. And I think Hebrew is also an ancient language that could be understood by modern people. Someone told me last year when I was at Jerusalem. Anyhow, these texts, such text is passed down from a long period of time ago. And now we can definitely have a new twist of understanding on top of this text that's composed 2,000 years ago. As a scientist, you can then understand this text from the perspective of a scientist. If you are a religious practitioner, let it be Christian, let it be any kind of philosopher, then you can use your own wisdom to understand this text as well. So it is very common that we have different ways of understanding and of explaining this text. On one hand, I do feel such different kind of perspectives are necessary and are acceptable, because the wisdom that's passed from 2,000 years ago, in fact, it has such a treasure trove behind the simple languages. You can explain it in a very simple way or very profound way. It is really up to you on how you could explain it. It is unlike how nowadays people would feel we have to have a very we have to have a clear boundary between right and wrong. Lots of the understandings or knowledge that were proposed by many philosophers and many wise people were then differentiated as completely right or completely wrong. But after time, then people were able to find out that it was not necessarily true. Similarly, people may make right or wrong choices when they were young, but when they grow up, what they used to think was right, they no longer feel so. So things do change. There's no clear boundary in terms of explanation in such a way. When I was first moved to Larungar, I had a very particular way of thinking. And then after time passed by, I went to different places, got to know different people. And then that's when I realized, well, maybe what I thought was right is not necessarily right to other people. Similarly, when time changes, when social structure changes, when our society changes, our norms changes, your idea of right and wrong would also change. The philosophy of Confucius, you could say, are included in this Analects. Of course, many people would disagree that this is the author is Confucius. People felt that it is rather a compilation of Confucius' disciples' words, at least the majority of it, other than a few chapters. But what I think is that it is not necessarily that Confucius had to say all of it to make this text valuable. Many scholars differentiate the disciples according to the disciples of the foremost importance and of the less importance. I don't think if the disciples would have heard the way they were distinguished, I don't think the disciples would feel very comfortable, very happy about it. Anyhow, this Analects is a compilation of the teachings both taught directly from Confucius as well as from his disciples and disciples of disciples. So let's look at the sutra. The sutras are usually conversations given by the Buddha or conversations that happened with the Buddha and the Buddha's disciples. And after the Buddha had such conversation, the disciples who have the memory dharani, or the infallible memory capability, they then transcribe them into words. In terms of sutra, there are the ones that's spoken directly by the Buddha. There are the ones where the Buddha would bless the disciples, and then the disciples, and through the disciples' words, as well as through other disciples or through other people. So that's the recording of the Buddha's teaching that is called the sutra, as well as in Christianity, the Bible is also a recording that is recorded by the disciples. In the Analects, the conversations between the Confucius and his disciples are rather simple. He didn't give very profound teachings on the micro world, such as the ones that is taught in the physics, in the quantum physics, or the macro, or from the macro perspective. So when we compare the sutras and the teachings of Confucius, we will be able to see there are some differences, such as the Vimalakirti Sutra and the Lotus Sutra and the Sutra of the Jewel Accumulation, or Sutra of a Great Jewel Heap. Lots of the content within those sutras are quite vast and profound, and the characters who appears in those sutras are rather quite complex, and the teachings are profound. So when you really engage in studying of the sutra, it takes a great amount of time to study the hundreds and volumes of the sutra. Similarly to other religions, there are philosophers, there are the religious people who then transcribed their great teachings, which made lots of impact, positive impact in human history. However, if we stand in a rather objective way, then you'll be able to see with your own wisdom the texts of Confucius and the texts of all the Confucius teachings, as well as other religious texts and the texts from Buddhism, you'll be able to feel there are some differences among those kind of texts, and you may feel that it is really worthy of analysis. I am not trying to sell it to you so that you can read into the Buddhism texts, but I am just calling or advocating that you should read into different kind of texts so that you can delve into different philosophies and wisdom that is composed throughout history. What do you think of Confucius? Very good. The picture of Confucius, he has a long beard. Do you think that's good? Maybe Confucius looks like Vimalakirti. I think that's really just a depiction of the people from the modern days. Rather, therefore, the picture could be very different than how he really looked like. Ponzo Rinpoche also lived till 72 years old. During Cultural Revolution, it was wrong to study Confucius' teachings, and I also criticized him as well. And now we're studying it. It's really a change of time. So, the Analects, in fact, it is edited conversation or collection of conversation between Confucius and his disciples. The influence of this text, the Analects, has great influence over the world. In the West, lots of scholars they're quite interested in this text. About 300 years ago, many scholars from different countries then translated this text into different languages. Directly translating from the ancient Chinese version was first translated into English back in 1809. He really wanted to understand. He was a pastor, and he really wanted to understand the Chinese philosophy. Until now, there are about 20 different editions of English translation alone. And there are many other different languages, and this text is also translated into many other different languages as well. The Eastern philosophy is quite crucial to our modern world. Once it is translated into the English language, some of the teachings are translated directly, and some of them are translated based on the meaning. The Analects is rather quite fragmented. It is a fragment of conversation and a fragment of quotations and so on. And this kind of fragmentation of quotations are not really suitable for the Western audience because the Western audience are very much used to logical descriptions. Therefore, some Western and Eastern scholars, they adapted a method of omission and addition method of recomposing or re-edit this text so that it would be easier for the Western audience to understand. However, I think when it comes to translation alone, I don't think that's very appropriate because when it comes to addition and omission, when you have too much of those, then it is no longer original. Previously, when I use other people's translations, I noticed that it is really difficult to use their translations because they would then have some additions and omissions. And it creates some differences between the original meaning. When it comes to addition in terms of explanation or commentary, then it is fine to make some additions to explain the text. However, when it comes to translation, I think it is best to be concise. There are people who study Tibetan, who study other different languages, and for those of you who have such opportunity to give teachings, it is fine for you to express verbally so that other people will be able to understand. But when it comes to written translation, it is best to then translate exactly as it is. When you are adding any content, any words to further explain the original text, then it is best for you to make some side footnotes so that people would know. Without such a footnote, if you only make additions or omissions, that is irresponsible. There's another way of translation. It is translation with commentary or translation with additions. Great translators from around the Mingguo period of time, they in fact, such as Lin Yutang as well as Thomas Guo, he then used both of them, in fact, they also made translations of the Analects. When we look at Thomas Guo, who was an outstanding scholar, I think many of you probably know him. During his period of time, he grew up rather in the West. He grew up in Germany. He received lots of Western education. It is reasonable to say that he had lots of habitual patterns then cultivated in the West rather than the East. However, he has deep-rooted Eastern philosophy in him. It is said that he has 13 PhDs, and he speaks fluently 9 different kinds of languages. which is quite incredible. When people could speak 3 or 4 different languages, if the way they walk is completely different, they feel that they are so great they can speak so many languages. But look at Thomas Kuo, who then lived around that period of time. He speaks German, English, and Portuguese, because his mother is Portuguese. So he speaks fluently of all those languages. But as a person who grew up in the West, who was educated in the West, he had a long hair, braided hair, as the ancient Chinese man would do, and he never abandoned any of the rules and politeness that is taught in the Eastern culture. Once he was invited into a dinner, a Western scholar asked Thomas Kuo, saying that, "What is so important about Confucius? What's the meaning of Confucius?" He said in such a way that looks down at him during the dinner. And then Thomas Kuo said to him, when science and technological advancement in the West is prosperous, of course, we do have great admiration towards that aspect of that kind of development of the West. However, as you see, I was then asked to sit on the top seat of this dinner table. But if all of us were then treated in, if all of us were then studied in the Western culture, following the Western cultural way, then we would be fighting for the best seat, and we won't be enjoying our meal as of now. So he had this great confidence in his culture. He understood very clearly, if everyone uphold this kind of Western thinking of individualism, then everyone would want to sit at the best seat, and no one would be able to enjoy the meal or enjoy the benefit or profits. So that is the teaching and the philosophy of Thomas Kuo. And he, in fact, also wrote an essay, or rather, he wrote a book which titled The Philosophy of Confucius. I think he composed that in English. I once saw this book in a bookstore at the airport. It is quite important to maintain a root that is the Eastern philosophy. Nowadays, I think what people do is that they care a lot about the skills, but you have to understand where your skills would be rooted. If you do not have the wisdom of being human, although you have lots of technology and lots of science, but living in this world without the wisdom of being a human first, you will still have lots of suffering in this world, despite all the technological advancement and skills that you may possess. So within the texts that is then composed from ancient times and the ancient wisdom that's passed down, in fact, it includes lots of the wisdom of how to work around our emotions, including the Analects as well as the Buddhism teachings. Once you understand how to manage your emotions, then you'll be able to live your life rather at ease. Everyone has freedom, during choosing your own path, during choosing your own philosophy. If you were to pick the wrong kind of philosophy, you will end up in the quagmire of bad emotions and lots of suffering. And if you were to choose the right philosophy to guide your life, then you probably will live your life in a much happier way. So now let's really get into the Analects.
要讲什么？
So book 1.
第一篇其实这个《论语》的话
In the Analects, there are 20 books, or
20个大的这个
you can say chapters. And then there are 492 points or records. The pronunciation of Mandarin Chinese and Taiwanese Chinese are a bit different.
有些是学而片，片是变，片吧，有的是片，但很多人说变啊，就也有这样。然后那个学而变的话呢，就是
So book 1.
那么这一篇呢，
In this book, it
从这个学，就有些是他从那个里面随便挑一个字来讲，有些是他
the main subject is on teaching or studying. Rather, some of those
然后
are
首先呢，
listed
这个是我
differently.
以前课本上
I
也
think
是
the first
很多
one
人都
is
学过，就是问很多人这个论语里面
the
讲
first
什
one
么
is
呢
very
这一句
famous
把
for
大家都
Chinese
说
because
出
it
来
is
然后其
included
他
in
的
the
很多人不是特别
in
清楚
the
那
school
么
textbook.
首
So
先
the
呢，
majority
这
of
个
people
孔
know
子
this one, and
他
that's
是这样
probably
说
only
的，
one
就
that they know.
是学而时
And
习
then the
之
first one,
不
the
亦
master
乐乎
says, the master is a
然后
Confucius and
这是
said
这
that
是一
is
个
it not
然后
a
有朋
pleasure to
就是
learn, and
自
when
远方
it
来
is
这个不
timely
亦
to
乐乎
practice what you have
这
learned?
是第二个
Is
方
it
面
not a
内容
joy to
然后
have
人不知
friends
而
coming
不
from
语
afar?
也
Is it not
什么不以君子
gentlemanly
乎
not to
就是
become
他
resentful
大概就是
if
三层
no
内容
one takes
首
notice
先
of
的
your
话呢
learning?
当然
So
我
it
刚
has
才讲的
3
这个确实
layers
论语
of
是
meaning.
很多的这个
According
解释
to
方
many
式都
commentaries,
不相同
apparently there are
就
different
是
ways of
就很多都
understanding
不相同
the
那我们还
Analects.
是以
But
以
I
我
am
自
going
己
to
的
use
分
my
别来
own
就是做
thoughts
这
to
个方面的理
express
解
my own
就是它这里
understanding
的
of this.
意思的话呢，就是我们这个就是追求学
I'm
问
going to
以后
use
的
my
话
own
呢
language to express
那么
my
就
own
是长
understanding
时
of
间
this.
或者呢就是说是
So the first one, it
这
says
个
that
合适
when
的时候呢
it is the
就
right
开
time,
始进行这个
first of all, you
关
should
系
take pleasure
关
in
系
learning.
那这样
And
的
then
话
when
呢
it
就
is
不是很高兴
appropriate
的事
time, then
不是
you
很
should
快
practice what
快乐
you
的
have
事嘛
learned.
就是
Isn't
不
that
是很喜悦的事嘛
a pleasant
有
thing?
些学者解释的时候呢，就是他说这是一
According
个
to
传统思想
according
其
to
实我们
some
这个学
scholar,
习
they
再
said
去
that
复习的话呢，这不是什么
this
快乐
is
的事
really a
情
way of just
很痛苦的事
expressing
情
it.
又要
It's really
考
not
试
a
啊
pleasure
是
to
的又要这
study
个
because you have to go through
这个温
exams,
习
you
的话
have
呢
to
就是
then
那这不是什么快乐的事这
repeatedly
这孔子就
then
说的不是
review
很
it
好
so
的
that you understand it.
如果从我们
Some
这个
some
书
some
认的一
people
些平
used to
时的我
say
们的
that.
习气来讲的话
Yes,
呢
according
也许
to
可能
our
是
own
学
habitual
完了以后
patterns,
还要去复习
it
啊
could
确实比
be
较痛苦的
quite
事情就是也可以这么讲但实际
distressful
上这里面的
when
这
it
个
comes
意
to
思的话
studying,
呢
when
就
it
是我们
comes
这
to
个
practice, when it
从
comes
这
to
个胜任
repeating
先任
it.
或者说
But
是这个
when
追求高尚智
and
慧的人来
if
讲啊
you're
学
a
而
wise
这个
one,
传
one
习
with
的话
wisdom,
呢确实
then
是一个
studying
快乐的
and
事情为
practice
什么呢
and
因为这个
repeating
学
it,
习呢
you
人
will
生
feel
当中
lots
非
of
常有
joy
意
through
义
doing
然后
such
刚开始学习呢就
doing
也许
such
可能比
things.
较这个比
Why
较
is that?
很难
Because
就
without
这个
studying, you
进
won't
步
be able to make
但
much
是
of
学
a
着学着的
progress
话呢
within your
最后呢
life.
就是他
And
会有一种
throughout
感受啊
studying,
在这个时候不断
you
的这个
will
传习啊不断的
gain some
传习
insights
的话
from
呢
the
到一
study.
定的时候呢
And
他
then
那种这个
you
学
should
习呢没有任
repeat
何这个困难
again
哎
and
就
again.
像我们这个佛教里面呢就是讲这个文思修
In
习
Buddhism, we
文
talk
思刚开
about
始老师呢就
studying,
进行了进行
contemplation, and
然后进
practice.
行呢
First of all, you
思
should
维
then study
哎
from a
进行
teacher,
思维
and then
然后进
you
行
should
思维以后呢就
contemplate
再去
about
传习的话
yourself,
呢那么最后你的这个修行到达一定
and
的
then
境界的时候呢你都已经上
repeatedly
瘾了
practice
不会
until
不会
you
放
get
弃的
very
包
much
括我们现在
familiarized
有些
with
学
it.
习佛法的
And
刚
then
开始都不
eventually
想
you
去然后
feel
听着听着呢好
rather
像有点感觉
quite
回来的话呢
happy
确实有点
about
上瘾
learning.
了
There are
就不愿
people
意
at
放
first
手
they didn't
哇
want
这个
to
对人生
study,
很有帮助
and
以前
then
我说非常
throughout
迷茫
listening
现在
again
很
and
有意
again,
思了我
they
不管怎
felt
么样的再怎么样
that
忙的话那就不会
learning
放弃
is
对
indeed
这个学习
quite
啊就是有一
addictive.
种特别好的这种感 感受啊，就这是一种快乐
So
的
that
思
is
维。为什么我
why
们现在
studying
有些人
could
呢，
be
就非
quite
要就是
joyful,
你
because
做
at
这
the
个学
first
习
you
的时
may
候
be
呢，
quite
原来
confused,
实
but
践和
through
不爱
studying
学习的人，
you'll
现
be
在还
able
是
to
特别
find a
特别
clear
的进
way,
取啊，就
and
是
you'll
这
be
是
able
一
to
种。
find
就是
out
现在的有些
some
话来
clear
讲的话呢，
guide,
他们什么学霸的话呢，
clear
就是
path.
共同点，就是共同点是什么
Nowadays,
呢？
they say
就是
that
吸求
there
知识
are
啊。
the ones who
我
are
有时候也
very
是可以
good
看出来，我
at
们这里有一些特
studying.
别
They
喜
have
欢这个文
a
字的这些人
common,
的话呢，
there is
每一
something
堂课
common
的话呢，
about them.
他们
That is
非
that
常
they
大的这
really
种
enjoy
欢喜
study. They
心
really
啊，这个
enjoy
就开始
knowledge.
对
They
这
really
个
enjoy
知识的
gaining
这
more
种这个
knowledge, and they're very
追求也好，
curious
就是然后
about
这种
learning
好奇心呢，就是
the
特别的
knowledge.
这种
And
强
they
烈
have
啊，就
a
这是
sense of pleasure
对可
to
能
get
特别
knowledge.
懒惰的
And
人，特
when
别
it
不爱
comes
学习的
to
人呢，
the
这个
lazy
进行学习
ones,
是一
and
个
comes to the
很
ones
痛苦
who
的事情。
haven't
这是我
got
们可
into
以
the
这么讲
habit
的
about
就包
study,
括郎
then
中先生的话，那这个地
they
方的
feel
有些
rather
观点我还
quite
是不一定是这个同意的。就是他
painful.
说现在的很多孩子都是不
According
喜欢，但是
to
很多孩子
Master
也
Nan
喜欢学习。
Huaijin, who is a
所以
great
就是
Chinese
这个
scholar,
孔子也不一定是讲
he
的是
said
现在
that
的孩子，对
many
这我
children
们
do
成
not
人
like
的话，
studying
很多
anymore,
不一样
and it is
也可以
suffering
讲。
to
当然
them.
这个
I
有些
would
学者的话
disagree
呢，
with
就是
him
前面的
because
这一
I
段话
still
呢，
know that
因为
there are
孔子
people
他
who
自己的
really
这个
enjoy
人生啊，就是
knowledge.
从1岁，就是他3岁的时候，父亲已经本来是他是一
Confucius,
个松国人，然后
his
荷兰呢就是
father
闹这个民
died
国去
rather
了。
quite
松国的时候，他
young
们家
when he
庭
was
条件
at a
很好
quite a
的，
young
然后
age.
到了后来
And
呢，
his
就是
father,
变成
when
一个
his
非常
father was
贫寒
alive,
的，
he
就什么这个
his family was
无少
rich
无少
and
见是
very
吧？
has a
孔
high
子他自己
status.
也是我上面
But
是一个
once
很卑
his
贱的
father
人啊，
died, he moved
就书到
to
很
a
多
different
细
country,
学，后来就是一直到15岁呢，
and
就是还在学一些
he
其他的老
his
师啊，
family
那个时候没有
then
现在所谓的中学啊、大
didn't
学
keep
啊，
up
就是
with
那
a
样的
good
读书。那读书的话呢，他们有一些就是说是这一段的话呢，
livelihood
主
at
要
that
是
time.
这个孔子呢，就是他自己这个从
And
1岁
he
到这个
actually had to
这
do
个10来
many
岁的这个
different
出
kind
血
of
的这种阶
works
段。
and
那
jobs
出
in
血的
order
阶
to
段来讲呢，他自己
survive.
就描述了自己那个时候
And
呢，就
over
是他
here
非
it
常的
has
这
three
个欢喜，就
aspects.
是学习
It
呢，
is said
就是
that
特别这个喜
in
欢，
some
不是我们
commentary,
有些人一所完复
this
修行的时候特别
describes
就是痛苦，不是
Confucius'
这样的。他一做那
Confucius's
个学习和
life
修行的话，那就是特别的这种开心，就是这是
stages
非
of
常
life or
快乐啊，就
phases
是
of
这
life.
这
The
也
first
是
one talks about
我
when
们
he
这个
was
这
studying,
一篇
and
当
the
中
second
的话呢，
part
就是这一章
was
当中的话呢，就讲了
when
3种这个
his
幸福
friends
啊，
came
首
over.
先
That's
是督促
around
啊，这个传
the
习呢，就是
mid
非常的
age,
这个
and
快乐
then
啊，就
later
这
in
一边
his
呢，
age,
我想我们这个
it
读
is
书也
that
是
when
一
people
样
do
的，
not
就是
acknowledge you,
只
you
要
still
刚
don't
开始就是
get
不断的
angry.
去学
So
的
it
话呢，
talks about
那
the
后
three
来呢，
phases
没有什么
throughout
这个
his life.
困难的事情。
Over
读书在
here,
经
it
当
talks
中也
about
不是
the
这样
three
的，什么
kinds
这
of
个究其不
pleasure.
成此事定非有，是吧？就是我们这个长期修学的话呢，就是没有一个不让
If
这
we
个
can
承担的事
continuously
情
to
啊，
study,
就是
then
是
we will be
就是
able
什
to
么读书百遍，细语思现
understand.
啊，就实践当中读书百遍，就是
And
读书100
in
遍的
the
话，那就是细语
Chinese
思现。以前我那个刚开始讲大圆满前
sayings,
言的时候呢，
they say that
我让他们
the
看
Chinese,
50
one
遍
of the old
然后
Chinese
有
saying,
些
it
学
says
生
that
就是说是
if you
当
could
时刚开始
repeat
特别
it
痛苦，他
after
读了这个大概
100
20-30
times,
遍的时
the
候呢，
meaning
确
of
实是
the
特别喜
text
欢，
will
最
be
后的话
able
呢，
to
认
then
真爱上了
manifest
这本书
very
就
naturally.
不像刚开始一样，就是
I
就
recommended
还是
people to
非常有
continuously
兴趣的。就
and
所以说呢，我
repeatedly
们这
to
个
read the words
真
of
正
my
这个学
perfect
习的话
teacher.
呢，
At
到
first,
最后
it
啊，
may
就是
feel
自己
quite
真正
painful,
通达了
but
其
a
中
person
意
told
义
me
的话
that
呢，就
after
不会
she
反
read
复
it
哎，
for 20
这是一个
times,
方
she
面。
felt
还有
really
一个方面的话呢，
enjoyed,
我们
she
这个这
really
样的学
enjoyed
习
the
以后呢，
teaching,
就
she
是
really
这个复
enjoyed
习
the
很重要
textbook.
的啊，就是像我的话呢，我以前也讲过吧，
In
我们这个
Larungar,
学院当中以前上
Ponsok
过一
Rinpoche
做
used
一
to
个
give
大课
teaching
演
in
讲，
large
然后
groups,
讲完了以后的话
for
呢，就是在
two
下
large
面就是
groups, and then
有一些
lots
当时
of
高等干部
temples
啊，就是
would
他们
then
就
give
讲完了
mentoring
以后，就是
classes,
就开始
mentoring
就
groups.
然后下完
And after such a mentoring session, we would then head to different smaller classes for tutoring class, and then for another tutoring class. So we continuously and repetitively listening to the classes again and again within just one day, and we do that almost every day. And in such a way, we learned our knowledge in a rather very profound way, and in a way that it's very difficult for us to forget. So nowadays, over here, after the classes, we have the discussion groups, and during the discussion groups, people can repeat the class content again so that it helps them to remember. A German scholar recently did this research where he studied that if a person could repeat the content right after, then he could remember 100% almost. And then if he repeats after 6 hours, then it only lasts. Then the residue of the knowledge is about 60 or 80 or something percent. And after a few days, the knowledge that's left in the mind is only about 50%. So it is quite necessary for you to repeat right after listening to the class so that the knowledge will stay in your mind. Otherwise, if you only listen to the class but not really review or repeat after the class and delay the repetition after a few days and keep postponing such a process in such a way you won't be able to remember anything after a few days. And that's why I encourage you to repeat very quickly right after studying and then repeat again and again so that you'll be able to remember the knowledge that you study. The second, it says that is it not a joy to have friends coming from afar? Well, nowadays people sometimes feel that it is not necessarily true because when you have friends over, you have to then take care of them, and some of the friends are rather quite picky. And when you're very nice to them, they would then take it in the way that they would take such a thing for granted. They would feel that's why modern people would feel that when friends come over, that is rather not a happy thing, but it's a painful thing. Maybe it happens. Especially during Dharma assembly, lots of our Sangha members feel rather quite painful because lots of friends would visit them and they would have the high altitude sickness. They would then ask for places to stay and lots of habitual patterns that wouldn't fit into the current environment. Whatever you do, they are not pleased. And in such a way, they do not want to host their friends anymore. Right away, they give rise to the mind of renunciation. Maybe not bodhicitta yet, but renunciation for sure. So, from the aspect of worldly means, there are friends who come over that may create or may cause suffering to you. But over here, what Confucius said, it probably means are the kind of friends who are kindred friends. And when such friends come and visit, that's really a wonderful thing. And in Buddhism, we talk about the good spiritual friend. And such kind of good spiritual friends, on one hand, they're very nice to you, because such friends who are kindred, who are wise, then they would bring lots of wisdom and knowledge along with them. They'll share with you about what you didn't know before, and you can also share back. Just as a person who then went to the West and another person who is in the East. And if these two friends meet up, and then they can start to have meaningful discussions. Just as stated in Sakya Pandita's Treasury of Good Advice, where it says that when two people engage in discussion, further worthy wisdom can arise. Just like mixing turmeric with borax, another color is then produced. Just as if you could then discuss philosophy and then with someone who is good at Buddhism, and in such a way, the two different kinds of thoughts can create something very creative and create something very profound. Turmeric powder is yellow, and borax is red.
就是这两个配在一起的色粉呢，
And the
它
color
就
that
变
is
出来
then
的这种颜
mixed
色呢，就是特别
is
鲜艳
better
灿烂，
than
特别就是
turmeric
耀
only
眼
or
夺目啊，
borax
特别
only.
好看的，就是所以我们两个这个
So
人呢，
the
就是
two
如果寄居在一
colors
起啊，这两
mixed
个都有
together
特
is
别
just like
特
the
别
two
比如
wise
说
ones
一
who
个是
can
对
make
这个传统
discussions.
文化很重视，
Maybe
一个是
one
对
is
现代
very
这个
good
科
at
技
traditional
慢，
culture, and the other
或
one
者
is
呢
very
就是
good
说是
at
一个人
modern
是这个
technology, and
对
one
自
is
我的这
very
种
good
这个超
at
超乎方面很好，一个人是
taming
对于
his
他
or
方
her
面
own
很好，
mind, and the
那
other
这样的话
person
呢
is
就
very
不
good
用
at
起到
benefiting
非常这个好的作用。以前
other
我们也
sentient
讲过
beings
这个
with
佛陀就是对
skillful
阿难就是
means.
说是两个人呢就是可以做
Just
大的
as
辅导
the
作
Buddha
用，那
said,
么一个人呢就是
the
可以这个听闻，有一个
greatest
人呢可以
merit
讲
that
授
two
这个。
people
那
can
么这两
create
个
is
虽然
that
是两个人，
one
但是两
person
个人
give
呢，
teaching
如
and
果
the
在
other
智慧
one
上能进行
listens
交流的话呢，
wholeheartedly.
就确实是
So
如这个前述为
when
引，
two
非
wise
常
ones
非
could
常这
make
个
great
有意
discussions,
义的。
then
就
it
所
is
以它这
meaningful.
里呢，就是我们可以来说啊，就是如果这个
When
从远方而来
friend
的话呢，
comes
就是
from
也是
afar,
应该就是特别
it's
的这个开
quite
心，
a
不应
joyful
该就是
thing.
说非常
I
的
think
痛苦。我
for
们世间人的
mundane
话，可能
people,
吃
we
啊
only
住啊，
talk
就是
about
或者说是个
the
人的这个
food
烦恼
and
啊，就是本来
the
自己的是对人
mundane
际关系不太好，
livelihood,
再
and
再
they
加
have
上
lots
来了
of
一个熟悉的
afflictions
人
in
的话
their
呢，你可能
family.
更加
And
这
then
个
if
心烦意
someone
乱
comes
的。
to
但实际上
comes
不是
over
这
to
样的。
visit
从
you,
这个层面来讲呢，
then of
有
course
些
you
学
feel
者呢就是
rather
32
quite
岁，
disturbed.
这个孔子的话呢，就是到了这个30岁以后的话
According
呢，
to
就是对
Confucius,
整个
he
社会的
said
这个社交
a
这个活
person
动呢
should
就
be
越来越好。
independent at the
所以
age of
在这个
30,
《论语》
and
当中
at
的
that
话呢，
time, the
其实
person should
这个《论
make
语》呢，就是里面的很多内容是比较幽默的，
should
就是
make
它这里面
contribution to
表
the
面上看起来
society and
就是
to
一个
this
非常
world.
艰难的事情，但实际上
On
呢，
the
啊，
surface,
就
it
是
seems that
不像我
it
们
is
一样的，有朋
quite
友来了很
simple,
开心
but
的。
the
什么样的
meaning
开心
within
呢？
it
因为
is
你对人就是有一
quite
种爱，
profound.
有
On
爱
one
的话呢，就
hand,
是那
a
可能牵
person
制这个机会
should
自己也
have
需要很，就
uh,
是牵制这
love
个
and
机会，我
compassion
的
towards
智慧呢，
everyone,
就是也可
especially
以
the
就是
friends,
直接就是分享给
or
他。这样一
including
来
the
的话呢，
friends.
就是那我
And
们
then on
就
the
是
other
应
hand,
该就是
you
做
could
人方面要好，
have
做事方面
meaningful
互相都
and
有很好的这个
enjoyable
帮助。所
discussions
以呢，
and
就
talks
是
with
从
your
这个方
friend
面呢，
that could
前面是这个这样的，学知
intrigue
识
even
是
more
开心
profound
开心
wisdom.
的事情。然后我们这边说，并不是有些人就是讲
There are
的一
people
样啊，
nowadays
我
who
谁都
do
不想
not
接触，
like
就最好不要来认，就是我自己住在自己的屋子
having
里面，
friends
不愿
over
意
at
见面，
all.
不
They
是
only
这样
want
的，
to be
特别孤
alone.
独的、寂寞
It
的，
is not like
不是
that.
这样的，就是应该是一个非常这个
We should be more
就开放的、
inclusive.
包容的这样的一个
So when
实
it
现
comes
的
to
一个。所以
interpersonal
跟人这个接
relationship,
触的
it
话
is
呢，就是
something
这也
very
是快
enjoyable.
乐的事
Just
情。就是
as
像我们大乘佛
the
法里面
Mahayana
呢，就是
teachings
要这
where
个
it
度
is
众
says
生，
that
度
it's
众生的话，
important
现在
to
从
liberate
自己的
sentient
亲朋好
beings.
友开始呢，就
And
是
we
进
should
行这个
start
度
with
众生。
the
所以这是
people
对
that's closest
对这
to
个
us.
来人的这种交往方面的话呢，就是有
So
一种
this
这
is a
种这个
teaching
思
about
想看法
interpersonal
这种思
relationships.
想。
And then
然
the
后第
third
三个
one
方面的
talks
话呢，就是
about
人不知而已啊，就是
is it not
什么这个不以
gentlemanly
君子
not
乎
to
意思
become
就是说，
resentful if
如
no
果
one
这个
takes
自
notice
己啊，
of your
就是自
learning?
己的学问也好，智
When
慧也
your
好，功德
wisdom,
也
your
好，那么
knowledge,
这些的
your
话呢，就是
merits,
别人都
your
不知道，
morality
别
is
人
not
都不知
known
道。
by
那
others.
这样的话呢，有些人觉得我这么出名，我这么有智慧的，怎么别人
Some
不知道，
people
别人都不理
in
我，
modern
很痛苦，
world
很
they
伤
feel
心，
quite
很生气。
resentful. Why
但
don't
是
they
他
know
不会
that
生
about
气
me?
啊，
Why
这
don't
就
they
是
know
难
I'm
道
such
不
a
是一
great
个君子
person?
的风度吗？
In
就
fact,
是就意思
when
是
people
别人对你不知道
do
评价，
not
别人对你
pay
怎么样
great
的话呢，
attention
你
to
不但
you,
不生气，就是
when
还
people do
很
not
乐观的
acknowledge
态度
you,
来去接受的话，那这不是一个非常
if
有
you
有
can
度量的、
still
有智慧的、有包
remain
容的一个君子的这种姿态
peaceful
这是
and
一
not
个
feeling
很好的事
resentful,
情。不像
isn't
我
that
们
something
有
a
些人的话
gentleman
那
would
就
do, a
我
noble
做
one
了这
would
么
do?
多的事情，怎么别人不知道？
There are
那
people
我的
nowadays
这个付出
constantly
呢，就是怎么
complain
别
that
人就是
I've
不
given
理
so
解
much, why don't they
啊，我是
understand? I
这
am
么
such
出
a
名的
famous
人，还别人
celebrity,
不
why
知
don't
道？
people
那
know
这样
me. In such a way, you're quite narrow-minded. Whenever I go to schools, there are people who don't really know me, and some teachers would then read my name in a wrong way, and they would call me Jida So or Mr. So. And it doesn't really create any disturbance to me. I don't feel angry about it. I know that my name could sound rather quite foreign to lots of people's ear. And when it comes to reading the name from a foreign language or meeting people from different ethnics and get to know their name. I think reading such name is very difficult, and therefore I understand when people read my name and encounter difficulties. And sometimes I would say that maybe it's difficult to pronounce my name, so why don't you just call me sir, or you can call me professor.
现在这个社会上啊，就是有时候找不到，就是可能就是自己
People seek for acknowledgement,
这个时候呢，就是
and when you don't get it, you feel resentful. That's how people feel nowadays. But Confucius is rather very different. Later on in the next part, there was a story where Confucius got lost in the city, and then his disciple found him at the east gate. And his disciple said that, "Why are you running off like this? You're running off like a stray dog." And Confucius, instead of feeling angry, he said, "Oh, yes, I'm like a stray dog." Doesn't matter how people would call him, the foolish one or the stray dog. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how what people think of you or say to you or acknowledge you or not, or in special occasions if they address you correctly or not. It doesn't matter. I remember once during a meeting, a leader forgot a very important leader's name was not addressed in that meeting, and then the other leader came to that person saying that, "I did this as well. Why don't you acknowledge me?" Maybe someone knows who I'm talking about. It was a meeting that happened.
所以我们现在呢，就是可以这么讲，就是说，应该说，这个，可能，
So Confucius' philosophy
当中的话呢，很有我们的这个时间
has some applicable connotations to our life, and it is very much connected to our practice as well in terms of Buddhism. In Buddhism, we say it is quite important to transform anything onto the path, especially when you did something, when you did hard work and people do not acknowledge you. As a practitioner, you should feel that, oh, it's wonderful, I can transform it onto the path of practice. Unlike practitioners, the modern world would rather, or the mundane people would rather feel that, why am I not acknowledged? And people in our modern world concentrate too much onto wealth, onto the power, onto status. And they would compare themselves with the people around them. For example, they would feel that, see, I earn about 10,000 RMB per month. How much do you earn? And the other person, if the other person's salary is about 5,000 RMB, then right away the one who earns more would feel would belittle the other. Similar things apply to power or authoritative positions. This is the common scene that happens in our world, in our society. Unlike our modern society, in the ancient society, what was emphasized the most was the morality within. And it also talks about you should not be disturbed by anything, including when people come to visit you as friends, or when people do not acknowledge you when it comes to studying, in any kinds of activities within life, a person should remain happy.
有些人把这一段呢，就是以为是孔子呢，就是后来就是这个什么这个巫师。
Some people would say that the last sentence where it says that even if people do not acknowledge you, you should not feel resentful. That is written, or that is then taught at the age of 50. When Confucius was at the age of 50, because he said that at the age of 50, a person should be accepting oneself. As practitioners, as people with great wisdom, they would view other people's comments rather quite lightly. Whatever others people say, they would take it very lightly. They would remain happy and joyful all the time. So over here it talks about how to then study with pleasure, how to meet friends with pleasure, and how to face all kinds of criticisms with pleasure, at least without resentment. So the first three talks about the value or the view of happiness. Today I met a Kempo in the morning. During lunch, we had breakfast together. He came with someone else, and he said, I asked him, what are you coming here for? I said, sure, let's have samba today together. He said, what are you teaching today? And he asked me, what does the Analects say? He said that, isn't it a joy to have friends coming from afar? And the Kempo replied, oh, that's wonderful, I'll come a bit more often. So for those of you, if you're very good at studying this, you can find the practice even within Confucius' teachings. And we'll stop here today.